Good morning.
Good morning.
It is good to see you all. Good morning and good Sunday. Hi, Rick. In her hands, she held the whole wide world. In her hand, she held the whole wide world. There's a painting by someone who we know, whose name is Joan Columbus, of a woman, beautiful woman with flowing black hair, who's holding the whole wide world. My understanding is that she now has moved away and she lives in Mexico. She lives in the same place as does our guest this morning. Our guest this morning is the Reverend Tom Rosiello. Tom Rosiello is the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and the minister emeritus of First Parish in Stow and Acton in Massachusetts, where he previously served as senior minister for 16 years. I'm so happy that we get a chance to meet and connect with people whose ministerial and religious experience is different from ours. Mexico is farther than us than New Jersey, which is my home state, where I just was yesterday, and my mother says hello. Finding ways to connect with one another is such a beautiful challenge in the world. And I want to relate one story that might connect with what we're doing today. You work with a community of signers? Yeah. So when I was still living just outside of DC, a woman named Allende came up to me and she said, "I want you to help me with my poetry." And I said, "I'd be glad to help you with your poetry. What do you want me to do?" She said, "I want you to play drums while I recite the poetry." And I said, "That sounds great. I'm just confused about one thing." And she said, "What is it?" And I said, in my attempt at sign language, "How does poetry work when you are not speaking?" Terlin was deaf and she did not speak. So she said, "I will be signing with my hands, and it won't be the words that rhyme, it will be the gestures." So I was baffled by that. And I said, "What good is my drumming? Of what service is the drumming?" And she said, "Well, my poem is very exciting. It's about a group of people that goes on this great horse chase." But I said, "Well, what will be the experience of the audience? Because I'm assuming that the audience is also deaf." And she said, they won't hear you with their ears, Leon, but they'll hear you with their bodies and with their hearts. It was a beautiful way of becoming connected with a group of people and a community of people from whom I felt distant for no cause of my own. Years later, I was in the BART train in the Bay Area, California, and I saw a group of deaf kids signing, and they were cracking up. It was really late. It was like 11:30. There was no one else on the train except me. And when they laughed, I laughed because their laughter brought me joy. And they looked at me and they were like, and I couldn't read their gestures because I didn't know them, but I know human beings well enough to, they said something like, "Do you sign?" is what I heard them say. And I was like, "No, I just love you," right? And then they were like, "What?" If you don't sign, how did you understand the question? And then how did you respond with signs? So it was just a very funny thing. Finding ways to connect with one another is one of the most beautiful things we can do. For our opening hymn this morning, I want to invite you to open your hymnals to hymn number 121 for the singing of "We'll Build a Land." Are there any announcements this morning before we get going? I didn't ask. The one thing I want to say is that the flowers on the chancel this morning were brought to us by the lovely Barbara Abraham. Thank you, Barbara. There are Red Cross posters in the back. To be picked up and to be put around the town. There's a blood drive coming up on Friday, August the 9th. So please, if you have a place where you can distribute this to help with our blood drive effort, that would be wonderful. Tatum is here for the kids later today, and also has do you have an announcement as well? No, okay. So please open your hymnals to 121 and rise in body and spirit as you are willing and able, and please join in the singing of "We'll Build a Land."
Please be seated. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Polly met me in a church where I preached, a few weeks back, and said, could you possibly come up here? And I said, well, I might be able to. Let's see how the schedule works. So it's great fun. What a beautiful town you have. It's really wonderful to be with you and to really share, I hope, what you find is an important message story this morning. You just sang really words from two of the prophets, Isaiah and Amos. So this is your day for prophets, okay? Because I'd like to share some words from the prophet Micah, chapter 6, that have always been important to me, and you'll know why later on when I talk. With what shall we come before the holy and present myself? Shall I come with burnt offerings, with calves a year old, or thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? In your heart, you know what is good. And what is it that's required of you? To do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Well, I said to you earlier that the words from Micah, the question, what is it that is required of you? And the answer, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, are words that have always been important to me. You know, many years ago, when I was sworn in as an attorney, my other life, or one of my other lives, I heard those words speaking in my head. In my years as a district attorney and later as a defense attorney, often representing those who are poor or discriminated against, those words spoke to me daily. Those words are later, those same words are what called me to ministry, and in many ways have guided me in a ministry that, while serving a congregation, also included prison work, LGBTQ rights advocacy, and serving on social justice boards like the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. And over the years, I've heard those words come to me differently. Sometimes, like when I was a prosecutor, the focus was on redressing wrongs done to innocent victims. The emphasis was on justice with a capital J, if you will. Sometimes, as when I was engaged with the poor and the homeless, the elderly, or children challenged by disabilities, the emphasis has been on kindness and mercy. But the biggest difference in the way I heard those words was that early on, I heard them as saying what was required of me individually. I read that pronoun you in Micah as singular. What am I only as an individual? What is that I have to do? But as I grew in ministry, working with congregations and even groups of congregations, that question posed in the 6th chapter of Micah switched from a focus on what I alone was to do to what collectively we were doing. I began to understand the question posed by Micah as one of what is required of us. That led me to an understanding of my role in ministry differently. Not trying to do the work of justice and the acts of kindness and mercy alone, but to bring people together, communities together, especially congregations together, to do that work. Now, we all know that when we do things together, our actions are far more effective, far more far-reaching, usually more enlightened, and even more so than the most committed or energetic among us could ever accomplish alone. It became clear to me that the call to do justice, to act with mercy and kindness, was one asking us really to partner with others in doing that work. And I believe that captures what is or should be central to our Unitarian Universalist faith. I see it as our collective calling, beyond just the important work that we do to build and sustain beloved community, to care for each other, and to help people deepen their own spirituality. I believe there must be a component of our faith that reaches out to the greater community, even to the world. With our congregational polity and our long history of every church being very independent and guarded about that, the idea of congregations partnering is not something that comes particularly naturally to us. However, we also do have a long history of, in fact, coming together to do the work of justice. And I trace that idea of congregations coming together to do justice work back to the early 1800s. As immigrant laborers came into the cities like Boston, areas of poverty and social ills developed. Many of our 19th century reformers, as individuals, spoke out and acted and tried to remedy these sufferings. Even some churches did. But what became clear to them early on was that the task of doing justice was larger than any individual or any one congregation. In 1826, the Reverend Joseph Tuckerman began a ministry to the poor and the sick and the incarcerated, regardless of religious affiliations. In 1834, Boston area Unitarian churches came together to form the Benevolent Fraternity of Unitarian Churches. Excuse the overly masculine references, but that's what it was called. And each contributed resources to support and expand Tuckerman's ministry. This partnership of congregations still exists today, about 60 congregations in total. Still today serve the needs of the poor of inner city Boston. This organization of our churches is considered by many to be the oldest social service agency in the United States. Today, it's still going strong, and you probably know it by its present-day name, the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. Why this bit of history? Well, first, because I'm kind of a history buff, but more to the point, to show you that the kind of partnership for justice that I'm going to be speaking to you about today, congregations partnering laterally with each other, coming together, bringing resources together to address issues of justice, is actually part of our DNA. I've heard about the collaborative work that you've done with community partners in sustainability and affordable housing and programming connecting local youth with youth from Boston or Portsmouth, New Hampshire, I believe. So it seems to me your congregation is already ahead of the curve when it comes to partnering for justice. But I want to challenge you to think even bigger. Our world is much smaller today and far more interconnected than it was in the time of Tuckerman's early 1800s partnership of churches. We have the capacity, and I think the calling, to reach out much further than just our own communities. You may know the words to one of our familiar hymns, "Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. So true, those words. As important as it is to come together with other congregations to help with local needs, even regional or national needs, I think it is also important to go even bigger, beyond borders. And today in particular, I'm asking you to consider how you as a congregation or you as an individual might partner with a UU congregation in the middle of Mexico to do the much needed work of justice there. And I also just want you to know more about what your fellow UUs are doing in the middle of Mexico. There's a wonderful video describing the work of your fellow UUs and working with a dozen different NGOs in Mexico. And it was featured in our General Assembly this year. Perhaps some of you saw it there, but if not, I think Joan has put a link into the order of service where you can watch it at home. And I also have some slips of paper with the link on it that I'll have after for a coffee hour. Today, I'm asking you to consider, as a congregation and as individuals, partnering with your fellow UUs in Mexico in one of more than a dozen projects where they in turn are partnering with local organizations to bring about truly meaningful change. You know, it sometimes amazes me how little meaningful connection people in the U.S. have with our neighbors to the south. Or maybe better said, how little they realize the connection that already exists. For example, I bet if you look at the labels in your grocery store, you'll find that most of the produce you buy is grown in Mexico. And what wasn't was probably harvested by Mexican laborers in the U.S. A water shortage in Mexico affects you. Children who need services because their dad has gone to the U.S. is partially caused by U.S. demand. And the list could go on. Look at your appliances, even your cars. They're probably now made in Mexico. There's a long history of the U.S. taking from Mexico and not giving much back. As an expat living most of the time in Mexico, welcomed there by Mexicans, I think we have an obligation to give back. Also, as UUs, I think we also have an obligation to stand up against the rising nationalism, isolationism, and anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S., especially as it's directed against Mexicans. We need to show our Mexican neighbors, who we so much depend upon, even for our food. We need that many Americans do not accept. We need to let them know that many Americans do not accept the misinformation, even the hateful views about them. They need to know that many of us recognize their contributions, respect their beautiful country and people, and want to help them where we can. I serve as minister of a congregation in the middle of Mexico. I moved to Mexico. I thought I was retiring, but I failed miserably. There was a growing congregation that needed a minister, and I again heard that sometimes annoying call from Micah. There was no shortage of social justice work that needed to be done. But maybe a bit smarter by the years, I knew no matter how much I tried to work alone, it wouldn't make a dent. Amazingly, the congregation in Mexico where I serve as minister for decades has worked together with their time, their talents and resources to do the work of justice and compassion. Alone, this congregation gives away $50,000 to $60,000, that's US dollars, not pesos, annually to these wonderful NGOs, and volunteers their time as well. Many of these NGOs were founded by UUs, and we have an intimate knowledge of their operation. We've learned that we are not the leaders, but the partners with the local Mexicans who operate these organizations. Our congregation is in fact doing incredible justice work. But the truth is, we realize that doing it alone really limits the reach and scope of what we can accomplish. So not long ago, we formed a social justice foundation within our congregation, specifically to help others partner with us in the work of doing justice and advancing kindness and mercy in Mexico. Currently, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of San Miguel Social Justice Foundation is helping to financially support and in many cases volunteering with 12 different organizations that provide hundreds, maybe thousands of children, women, families, migrants with life-changing, even life-sustaining health care, education, clean water, and simply a safe haven to rest and recuperate. All that work is featured in the video that you have a link to, and I hope you'll take a look at it. Well, when I'm in the US, I try to focus some of my preaching on raising funds and making connections for one or two of the NGOs that the foundation supports. I seek partners to help us partner in Mexico. And one that I'm particularly focusing on this summer is the Escuela de Educación Especial de San Miguel de Allende. It's an incredible school for the deaf. It currently is serving 33 students, most profoundly deaf. And I can tell you from my personal experience visiting with them, it is an amazing place that profoundly changes lives and benefits not only the students and their families, but the entire community. I have just a 5-minute video clip, and I don't know if our Lemonade setup would allow me to play it or not, but in one way or another, I'll get it to you, because it's a video of their choir performing. Now, that may sound a little unusual, but it kind of relates to your story. Basically, the music plays, they have a hearing person keep the beat, and they are signing the message. And they occasionally do that for our fellowship, for our musical offering. The joy that video brings me often brings tears to my eyes. And I have to tell you, a deaf child in Mexico is not the same as having a deaf child in the US. Sometimes parents hide the child away, embarrassed that it's God's punishment on them. They may lock the child in the house all day while the parents go to work. The public school system has no accessible education for them. But some parents believe that if they send the child to school anyway, God will somehow cure the deafness. Some of those children have sat in classrooms day after day, understanding nothing. And sometimes it takes a lot of convincing for parents to allow a deaf child to attend this wonderful school. But when they do, amazing things happen. I want to share a story. Her name is Laura Gabriela Rodriguez Ramirez. She's now 26. Laura, who is profoundly deaf and very smart, sailed through the primary and high school levels of the School for Deaf with great ease. She dreamed of going to university, but the only nearby university that offered classes to deaf students closed the program before she could enroll. Attending oral in-person classes would require a full-time sign interpreter to accompany her, which would be financially prohibitive, even if such an interpreter could be found. But Laura was persistent, and the school worked with her. She was accepted into an undergraduate online program from a very reputable university in Mexico City, but it was for hearing students. Her family supported her as they could, but the Escuela Especial paid the monthly fees and daily translated the lectures from Spanish to Mexican Sign Language. Think of the work. Laura received her bachelor degree in early childhood education last year, the first ever deaf woman from the state of Guanajuato to do so. She fulfilled her dream. She is now a teacher at the school, teaching youngsters who, just like her, are profoundly deaf. And it is amazing to see how inspired they are to have a teacher who is like them, Mexican and profoundly deaf. Not all these students will go to college, but they learn wonderful skills at the school. You'd be amazed, I wish I could have brought some with me, of the beautiful woodworking, jewelry making, and art that takes place there. One of these students has even illustrated a children's book written by a UU in both Spanish and English, which is about being a deaf child. But more than getting an education and learning these important skills, they're able to earn, that enable them to earn a living. These students have a real life at the school. One more story. Two other students, Antonio and Noelle, both attended the school for 11 years and became friends. And that friendship bloomed into a romance. And after graduating from the school, they decided to get married. Last Valentine's they did, with the help from the school, including the rather old Canadian UU director being the best man in the wedding. Many at the school attended. It was a great celebration. And the school pulled together a little fund to give them a 4-day honeymoon. They both are now working as teaching assistants in the primary grades and in the computer room. Laura, Antonio, and Noelle are just 3 examples of young people who had very dim prospects for a good life and now have a bright and happy future. The students in the schools, age 6 to 26, are provided with transportation, have classes and skills training every day. They're fed breakfast and lunch. Many services at the school are provided by funds from donors and volunteers. Many volunteers work there. What do you think the tuition to send a student for a full year to this amazing school is? $1,200 US per year. That covers the basic cost of one student. $1,200 is a lot of money in Mexico. Almost none of the families can afford to pay anything toward their deaf child's education. Right now, the school has 33 students, but it could accept another 10 or 12. So this summer, my goal is to ask other individual UUs and UU congregations to partner with us, to cover the cost of 1, maybe 2 students. In fact, I'm asking you if some of you in your congregation might partner with me in helping to cover the cost of 1 student, because I've asked that the fee you would usually give to a guest minister go instead to the UU Fellowship of San Miguel Social Justice Foundation to be given to the School for the Deaf in the name of your congregation. Perhaps your congregation might be interested in adding to that, and maybe even in partnering in the work of the school or in another one of the many NGOs we support. I'd love to talk with you more about it after the service. So thank you for the many ways that the UUs in Vermont are answering the question that Michael posed. Especially thank you for the ways you are partnering in the work of justice. I hope this message reminds you that our world is indeed one world, and inspires you to think bigger, to reach across borders and put our faith into action there as well. If you'd like to join me in contributing towards a scholarship for one of these students, you can give me a check, or you'll find that Joanne nicely printed a very not so complicated but rather lengthy explanation of how you can make a donation later. It's in your order of service. The work of justice requires partnership. Partnership in every direction. We partner with NGOs. We ask you to partner with us. We, your fellow UUs in Mexico, are partnering with NGOs that we know and trust. And we hope you'll partner with us as an individual or a congregation. Together in those words of the hymn that we sang at the beginning of the service, together, we will build a land where we bind up the broken, where we bring good tidings to the afflicted, and where justice will roll down like a mighty stream. So little from us can do so much in Mexico. So I look forward to answering your questions after the service, and many thanks for inviting me to bring this message to you this morning.